a la Unión Europea, a Bretton Woods Project, a la Fundación Gates, a la Fundación Forge, al Fondo de del Sur, a la Fundación Ford, a Global Green Fund y a la Fundación Wellspring. Espero que no me olvide ninguna, pero este evento ha sido posible a todas ellas, es un evento grande y hemos contado con este apoyo, ¿no? Entonces, un aplauso para estas organizaciones. Bien.
Bueno, entonces, sí, vamos a dar inicio. Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Reciban un saludo especial. Mi nombre es Germán Niño, soy colombiano. En este momento estoy a cargo del área de economías transformadoras.
Transformative economy. This is a panel for transformational economy. So, right next to, alongside the reflections that we've heard that are really important in the area of financial architecture and fiscal justice, we are also here with Eduardo Gudynas and Patricia Amat, also Armando de Negri, who's already on screen, and we have two more speakers, luxury speakers, Francine that's joining us from Belgium. Right now, it's almost midnight over there, and Aura Rodríguez from Colombia. So, of course, yeah. Let me broaden into each and one of the presentation of each and one of the people that will participate of this panel. But right now, it's of our interest right now to center our reflection and our focus on to the life and development subject. These are two spheres of life that alongside the complexity that we've been witnessing in fiscal matters and debt matters and the economy itself, the framework of reference to be able to talk about transformational economy takes us to to development and takes us to the recognition of a series of elements that are key when outlining where are we supposed to walk a path in what we've called a systemic crisis or multi-crisis, which is the scenario that we are debating about right now, creating ideas, encouraging dreams, and then making everything that we can to make this possible. But now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Eduardo Gudynas. Eduardo is joining us for quite some time already. He's a travel companion from Latin Dad and also of the reflections and takeaways that we've gotten from all of these experiences. Eduardo is not just that, but he's also a researcher from the Latin American Center of Social Ecology in Montevideo. He was the first Latin American in the lecture Arnet S of Ecology and Global Justice from the University of Oslo in Norway. He's a visitor researcher from the Center of Advanced Studies for the Munich University in Germany, associated of the Latin American Observatory of Environmental Conflict in Chile, and of course, within this task, he also joins organizations across South America, and he writes columns of opinion and publishes in articles in his different conditions. He just recently published a text that I would like to recommend that's called Very Far, It's Very Near, and it's about the impact of the war in Ukraine and its impacts in Latin America. So with no more further ado, please, we are at your disposal. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, for being here. Thank you very much to Latindad for inviting me and serving me with all of my maniacs that I have. I thought I have to leave, and maybe I won't be able to be in the last stage of this conversation. And I would like to apologize beforehand, but going straight to the subject, what I've been asked to do is to talk to you about alternatives, looking at transformational economy and what is their part in development. The current development and all the varieties of development, I'm not talking about them all being the same, but I recognize their differences, and all of them, they have in their own way a repetition of social impact, environmental impact, and a land impact. The same way that each one of these varieties, the pilots have been taking place at least in the last century and a half, the strategies of development and the ideas that we have behind it all condition public policies. And that's one of the elements that establishes what's acceptable or unacceptable. For example, for many ministers of economy or presidents, it's unthinkable the idea of a Peru that is not extractivist, or an Argentina that does not export soy. And at the same time, they see these citizen organizations as an obstacle for that development, for that progress. Given that I'm in Peru, and just because I'm here, I remember Alan Garcia with his metaphor of the whoever protest also block development. He was talking about that many years ago, but that isn't the case in the South American, Latin American cases. And that puts us in a subordination to globalization, being exporters of prime matter, of raw matter. But this resets the politics in its broadest sense. We accept violations of human rights, we accept injustice, and even high levels of violence, murders, homicides to people that defend the environment, and nothing happens. No president fell, or no person was taken out of his position because of it. But I'm going to take one of these stages, and what does it have in common? The massive extraction of natural resources to establish certain pattern of consumption. This graph is in millions of tons. So we've gone from 20 million to over 70 billion tons of natural resources that are extracted. This is a brutal growth. There's an aspect of this that economists do not understand, because economists make their own balance and they start from zero every year. But when I'm extract and the impact, like in copper and oil, this year we cannot add up to the previous one and the previous one and just back in time, because these are not renewable resources. So what's a part of Latin America in this whole situation? It's critical. And that's because this is a commercial physical scale. And this is the scale of what we export and what we import, but not measured in dollars, but measured in tons of minerals, fossil fuels, agri-food. And what happens, what I was summarizing here, is that as an introduction from the 1970s until a few years back, we went from a net deficit of 200 billion tons per year to over 700 billion tons per year. We are the biggest providers of natural resources, and this is the biggest problem in the base of development, because the scales that we're talking about, the scales of appropriation, are huge, and it depends on globalization. And another homage to Peru, there was a minister here that said that every night he was lighting a candle to his gods for China to continue buying raw matter off of us. Castilla. Okay, that's the dependency that I'm talking about. Once this experience has been introduced, and let me introduce this graphic made by colleagues in Central America, but for the whole region, between 1900 and all the 20th century, up to 2016. And higher than zero is what we import, and below that is what we lose every year. The impact since the 80s is an important increase of the import of natural resources, or the export of natural resources. This is something that's been happening for a long time already. And so all of the varieties of development that we've tried to do, from Vargas and Perón in Brazil and Argentina to progressism, they've all been extractivists, and they've all been following this pattern of insertion, all of them. Next one. So we have a geography of it. What is the international insertion? This was the situation in 1966. I was in school on where and the natural resources were going to and from. 99 billion tons net to North America, especially the U.S., and then we had, as a level of importance, 57 million to the countries of the Occident. So you can see the numbers. Let's put them in round numbers. 100 goes to North America, and 60 goes to Europe. Now look at it now. China. China is taking away 527 million. Just multiplied many times by what the US and Europe is worth. So what we were mentioning yesterday about China, we need to put it into scheme, because China is a huge vacuum of our natural resources. It's the one that establishes the patterns and development strategies. And at the same time, the consumption of natural resources from China is to feed off a consumption that's global. We process those natural resources, and then the final purchase can be in a supermarket in Brussels or in New York, or you can be here in Wong, that's 2 blocks away from here. So that pattern of consumption drags these levels of appropriation, and in that insertion is where we can find our countries. Any alternative strategy needs to have and take into account this global insertion, and any other alternative is unthinkable if we do not reconsider our role of as a subordinate to China. Next one. So how to move forward to this? There's an option which is staying between varieties of development. Options such as promising that the next variety of development would be better, and that's not going to have that negative influence in the social and environmental, and will redistribute the money for exports of copper or oil in a better way. By what I said before, that type of strategy doesn't work, and at the end the conventional development ends up swallowing it. So there's another option, which is the one that I'll carry on and I'll continue with, and it's going beyond development. Not just waiting on a human and wholesome development only, but rather trying to step out of development. And this shouldn't be interpreted in a cartoonish kind of way or dogmatic kind of way. What I want to say is I'm not going against development, because we will have certain elements of conventional development that are positive and need to be taken into account. But this is establishing a different framework that will go outside development itself with different interests and different goals. And for extractivism cases, which I've been asked to talk about a bit, what are the exit alternatives? This will be about or related to extractivism nowadays. And one aim is to establish strategies that aim to zero poverty and zero extinction of species with the same level of hierarchy under the big umbrella of the concept of well-being or living good. That I'm going to understand it by you, because I don't have time to elaborate on it. And so how would this exit strategies would work? Separating urgency and emergency measures and transformation measures. Important transformation about what happens in a country. So all of this guidance is focused onto justice, all of it. That's why it goes hand in hand with a lot of the inputs that we had this morning and yesterday's. How do we define transitions? Well, transitions are not revolutionary changes of everything from one day to the other. These are step-by-step ways of stepping out of what we're trying to get out of. If I was in Peru and if I was, the president is not going to disappear the exploitation of camisea overnight, but we will need to understand that there are wells in the Amazon that need to be closed down, and that is something that needs to be done. So urgency and emergency measures, and just as in the medical practice, you are the door in the hospital, the country is sick of extractivism. Urgency and emergency then is to revert the most dangerous effects. Our third element would be to take apart the dependency of globalization. We can have the copper price to increase, and then the next day everyone is looking after copper, looking for copper even in your backyard. So the examples and specific emergency and urgency measures allow us to have possible means to revert the political conditionality where the option of change is unthinkable or that we are afraid of, and that each step that we take will increase the possibility of giving a second and a third step. Next one. So in urgency and emergency measures in this stage, I can only give a couple of examples because of time. But the most urgent thing will be to have social and environmental impact of this situation, of the most dangerous or the most grave of them all. Next one. I have some examples that have to do with the countries that you're from. If I apply strategies, for example, to filter and to separate the most dangerous thing, what's killing my ecosystem and people, I have public policies to take care of it. We have them in some countries and they are not applied, and we have some new ones. But each and one of these instruments depends on the natural tool or the natural resource and why are we using it for. So all of the countries that you're from has a serious problem of illegal, informal mining, whatever you want to call it, of gold that destroys tropical environments, contaminates or pollutes land, and it's related or linked to corruption networks. So gold is an extractivism model that doesn't have sense anymore. Transitions go against extraction means, because only 10% of the gold that's extracted has industrial means, only 10% of it. And the gold that's outside of the soil can comply with that demand and its reusage. 90% is used only with superfluous means. 45% goes to jewelry, especially in the Middle East and China. And 45% goes to banks and coins. And one of the lessons of the Ukraine war that it's happening right now is that it's not clear. It's clear that we cannot have huge reserves of gold. Like Russia, for example, they have huge reserve of gold, but they cannot use it. And also the price of gold can also crumble apart. So in the case of gold, there's no more sense. There's different minerals that make sense, and we will need aluminum, copper to build certain certain electronics, and we need to work step by step towards what we want. The rates of energetic return of hydrocarbons are lesser and lesser, and translated, it means that to take out a barrel of oil, I need to invest more energy than what I'm taking out in oil. So in the case of fracking, or the rate of energetic return is almost 1-to-1. We consume 1 drum of oil. That happens because of subsidies. So that type of appropriation also disappears. How much time do I have? 6 minutes. Because I'm thinking about Colombia. You know, there's a new government, and there's a really hard discourse of a new energetic transition. We have we're not going to give more concessions, but we will keep on exploiting the concessions that we have. And one of the plans that we had, we taking into consideration 1 week before the elections when I was there, it was to refloat closed wells, to reactivate them, and to make an extraction of the permanent crude. And that will go against that transition. So you can say that's another element of the transition where each and one of the measures is weighted out, and what I'm doing will allow me to take the next step, and that's ongoing. Next slide, please.
The transitions require a present critical situation analysis and choose the debate that's ongoing in our countries in the groups that both Claes and I are part of. Tells us that we can create a coherent public policy strategies. They are internally coherent and therefore they are stable. That's the other key element that I wanted to underscore. Next. In, also as a headline, we have the major transformation measures to get us out of the urgency and emergency situation, because there will still be oil wells, there will be some mining activity. How do I reorganize our economy? Then how do I change the productive structure and some other components of our economy? Here I have gone back to some of the aspects of the economic dimension. One economic primary has to do with the dismantling perverse subsidies, extractivism in general, and against the common sense. Every time that we do the fine detailed accounts are financed by the states themselves, sometimes directly, other times more sort of indirectly, but domestic local financing is a key, and a lot of that comes through perverse subsidies, several of which can become legitimate subsidies, like for instance for agricultural reconversion. The feasibility and entrepreneurship studies should include job creation, energy consumption, water consumption, what is the carbon footprint, and so on and so forth. But this cost-benefit analysis is not engaged at the book fair that I just attended. I so I did not find in the mining economy handbook a chapter on the social and environmental costs. That cost is not just not there, because nobody ever deducts those costs or takes them into account. All that you have been discussing about tax justice would and would require to do away with that ghost that the country is going to end up with that money. In Lima, 10 or 15 years ago, not very far from here, we had organized the first workshop on these transitions where Pedro Franque, who was the Minister of Economy during the first stage of the Castillo presidency, did the first exercise to declare moratorium on new mining projects in Peru to correct prices from the environmental viewpoint. We export very cheap raw materials. The price never includes, for instance, the cost of medicine spent by used by affected communities, or how much is what is the cost of the destruction of agricultural soil. There's going to be replacements. There's going to be a way that we include replacements, and all that has to be included in the state's costing. An example from Colombia in their latest evaluation of tax revenues from oil and mining, where 0.4 of total rent earned by Colombia. But these accounts are different from what the companies file. I trust these ones, 0.4. Out of that 0.4%, 80% was contributed was paid by the state company, not by the private company. So the margin for social justice is huge. Likewise, when it comes to employment and jobs, in Colombia, Petro is proposing a productive reconversion to leave oil and coal behind in Colombia. That industry employs 195,000 people. That's the coal and oil industry. That's about 3 million people. Agriculture, 3 million. Service and trade is 6 million people. So job is not even an issue that would prevent the reconversion. So how would this work in Colombia? To pursue the Colombian example, Colombia exports about 125 million tons of natural resources annually. That has a huge impact. If the urgency and emergency measures are enforced in coming years, they could drop that down to 50 million tons annually. It doesn't mean that it's all going to go away totally, because I'm not going to solve all problems, but what I'm trying to do is save the patient from dying, and that it create better conditions for the next stage, that is to move to indispensable extraction, to extract only what we actually need, so that eventually we will arrive at an objective of zero poverty and a good living. At the end of the day, that means we have to redesign our global insertion. There are two key components there. One is the selective connection, linking to globalization, to stop depending on the quotation of minerals and metals in Canada or England, or providing raw materials to China as intermediate stage in those global networks. But that is only possible if at the same time there is a regionalism, a scheme that will give us back our independence and autonomy vis-a-vis that globalization. This is not an easy task, because for a number of circumstances, the imaginary of a regional integration has been attacked and eroded intensely. So it's important to find the appetite for another type of regionalism that will lead us out of globalization. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Bueno, les
Please do write down your questions, because one of the things that Eduardo has gotten used to is to challenge our imagination. I like his talks because he gets out of the script, and this is very provocative and very interesting approach. And now we're going to serve the second dish in this post-lunch debate, and we're going to do that together with Patricia. She is a Peruvian sociologist, a feminist, and a companion along a long travel, and she's a member of Remte. That's an important organization in Latin America, and she has prepared several very interesting documents. The report that she's going to share with us is available in the website. You can download that with the QR. Patty is going to be discussing the common goods, extractivism, and feminist economy. We expect that the transformative economy challenges will go in hand with all these thoughts that we have already started to share with you. Hello, good afternoon. we're going to take a twist of a hand, because this delight living, this prospect for a change did not always allow us to look at things that are going on in our countries. But to begin with, I want to thank everybody, the organizers, deeply for the invitation. 10 years ago, Latinette published a book entitled Why Economic is Vital and Vital is Not Important. And that was prepared by Diana Garcia and Rosamilia Salamanca. It's been also been 10 years since, along which this organization has grown, thinking about feminist economics is something that I'm really pleased and happy to be able to contribute to this process. And likewise, all the studies underway on tax policies and gender, the 3 years on training on feminist economy, that are such an interesting program, and everything that Veronica and Patricia and Regina have shared with us in regards of the gendered perspective in economics, I think is a way to transform the organization from within, and place the feminist look of economy and a more important position. I wanted to say that also that to share the platform with Eduardo because he has been a great disseminator and builder of extractivism theories throughout the region, and it'd be impossible at this point in time to, when we think about an analysis, it would be possible to think of an analysis that would not take into account the impact of extractivism and the economy as a whole, and therefore in the entire change and transition horizons perspectives. I have to say also that when I saw the name of the conference, that's after the pandemic, the war, truly, and that time I did not connect that directly with the Ukrainian war. I just thought about the war. I thought about all these disasters that we're facing, and for which we do not necessarily have from which we not necessarily have found a way out. This type of conflicts that are gradually devastating conviviality, the life in common, and that to some extent sometimes mean the end of politics. We have found that this is a perspective that we haven't faced on the wars that we are going through, the eco sides, feminist sides, the migrant populations that are gradually being relegated to the last link of the change. By the way, we haven't talked about much about migration. I think this is a cross-cutting issue in all our policy making and transition processes. And from the standpoint of the gendered feminist view of economy, we have called that a conflict between the capital and life. I wonder if you recall that we talked about as a conflict between the capital and life. This is something difficult that is hard to apprehend when we're proactively designing policies, finding ways out, coalitions and alliances, and in that course of a political life, it is hard to discuss something that we call the conflict between a capital and life, but we did. So the starting point from this view is that capital accumulation is an ongoing process. So we thought that after the COVID, it was going to sort of calm down a bit, but it's ongoing, and it's not only ongoing, it's becoming even more complex. The defenders, the environmental activists that have been murdered, the people's conflict with crime, organized crime, the illegal deforester, the semi-slavery of women and young people, drug trafficking, the gradual loss of community land, or the change in land use that make even more complex this story that we had built around Federation David Harry, because what this shows is that there are only these large corporations that are devouring the land, but that they are a menace, a threat to the communities, and not just because of these corporations are being deregulated, despite they aim at growing mining and soy and poultry, but now this is happening through the action of the settlers, our neighbors, that are putting pressure to expand the extractivist business, and that result in violence against the opposers. And by the way, those of us who are positioned in a horizon of a change with economic justice, we lack a clear agenda on security issues. So, in particular, in the areas where the state is absent or where it is present in a very subordinated and weak fashion. And I think this is an element that the present crisis is revealing, and these internecine and internal domestic wars that have really been taking place in our countries. And then the pandemic arrives, and we are locked down, and we are devastated, and leaves us so tired, in particular women. Veronica has shared with us, told us yesterday that the pandemic had aggravated gender inequalities and gaps, violence and poverty, and the over excessive burden of work on women that has made us step back years of progress, and the recovery of these livelihoods will be ever more difficult for them, for us women. And this is an allusion to a world in crisis in all its various types of manifestations, with many tentacles and under many names. I remember that before the pandemic, we talked at the civilizatory crisis, multidimensional crisis, but then this has this eco-social crisis has broadened, expanded. The climate crisis, for instance, and basically the sense, the meaning of the word crisis has changed. We no longer talk about a crisis as these spikes, peak times when we could intervene and trace a change strategy that would lead us to some moment of recovery down the road. But now things, these events seem to take place quickly, one after the other, and never giving us enough time to recover fully from the prior crisis. And of course, this will lead us to revise some issues that we had already started discussing from the viewpoint of a feminist economy. And one of them is the recognition of our vulnerability, our interdependence, the need for care. And this is something, or has been permanently something proposed as a way to challenge the self-sufficiency of women's economic that is reflected in the choice of the paths to follow of the economic activities. But matter of fact, this only reminds us that life is not guaranteed for anybody, and that matter of fact, it is in this relationship of cohabitation in this relational world that we will continue to grow and develop. And we also think that this perception of self-sufficiency was only underpinning a vision of masculinity and a patriarchal system that is the foundation, not the only one, not the only pillar. We just had a debate about this morning. This is not the only foundation, but it's an important foundation for the present economic order. And it is therefore it is key to expose it. And along that line of thinking, the commons, and I'm not going to delve into this because the text does elaborate on that. Here, what I just want to do is to look at what is the role of commons and a collective care of life as a political platform. It is a call to reestablish and to recreate our common links. It shows us that the life in common is at risk, and that the life of women that sustain that common life is at an even greater risk. But as Rita Seguridad said, that is why we have undertaken this historical project to recreate the links that move us to build communities. And in this conversation about the transformative economies and their perspectives, what women and women's praxis brings from the common life and a collective care seeks to reestablish, recreate these links that the political and economic order has left by the wayside. It seeks that we seek to put life at a center stage and to find a relationship between economy and a society that would not be uncoupled from the sustaining of a life, displacing the center of economic life that focuses on market economies and the consequent social relationships. This market society towards a society of life. The pandemic has accelerated our understanding of the path that we need to follow. Now it is crystal clear, and it is possible to realize the collective care is acquiring a centrality, not just in meetings like this and in the feminist circles, but also in all academic debates and political discussions underway. And that is why care, collective care, or care generally, has crossed the borders of women's sexual policies to take a predominant role in explaining transformational processes. I wonder if somebody saw the most recent Mexico Claxo conference, and it was very important there to see the care perspective and the feminist economy perspective was present in most of the academic and political pronouncement there, and it was taken as an explanation of the existing ongoing crisis. That's a role that they didn't have before. There is therefore some progress that's been made. It's a win that has been made possible without necessarily these wins being long-lasting, but at least we know that it may have an impact on fostering change in our countries. And along these lines of the politicization of the sustainability of life is a systemic political fight against a patriarchal order. We underscore this characteristic, and because this order is less and less legit, and I think that there we are all on the same page. Now spaces are opening for these political views that demand that the sustainability of life to be placed at center stage. And I am not admiring that Petra's inauguration speech has placed life at a center stage of policy-making, political life, and it is not just a matter of a confrontation between a conflict and the search for peace. It should be a critical axis of any kind of a policy making. And I feel also but I think that we still need to make further processes. For instance, recognizing that motherly care and care are political decisions. They are not the result of a rational choice. They have to do with conditions and possibilities so that they will eventually become effective. And this is embodied in people's bodies, and it is bodies that are trying to recover their sovereignty and not remain in a violent or denial position. And I think that as this neoliberal order slides down, decays, that opens the possibilities of radicalizing to a greater extent our own proposals. So, yes, indeed, we thought it was important that in this debate about the transformative economies, we should bring forth this debate that is reflected in the document that about the Labayala women, the Abayala women. I know that everybody's familiar with that. That's the mature, plentiful, flourishing land, a place that is at the origin of a name that is coined by the Kuna peoples south of Panama, north of Colombia. That was the first name that historically was designated the American continent. So when we talk about the women of Ayala, we're talking about a broad range of feelings, praxis, feelings of those women from our region who more visibly in recent years have left an imprint through their bodies and lives, their resistance to dispossession. These feminisms that are called indigenous feminisms, that are called in or community feminists, or decolonizing feminism, or popular feminism, the various names that this movement goes by, has to, and I say this very carefully, from the predominant feminist views, with an emphasis on their critical view, decolonizing view, and eco-feminist view, displacing the fight of women to put at the center the women that manage life, and they are eco-feminists. And this is another thing that I wanted to include in our plural feminism. The various positions that have evolved because there is a conjunction of a feminist and ecological awareness that challenge the way our bodies are treated as the material basis for life that we need to live. And I think it is important to point to the fact that some of these proposals, including the comments, are not part of a manifest, women's manifest. This is a tissue that is woven on the basis of their statements, on their fights, and generally everything that they can contribute to us. And this displacement within the feminism, sorry, did I run out of my time? Yes, well, this displacement of the feminisms has taken place in a recent year because of a preeminence of extractivism, this drift of corporate power through extractivism. And I also think that this has given more visibility and a voice to the women across the territories. And I wanted to also mention, but I don't have enough time, is perhaps to just by way of closure, but I know that I won't do it well. But we feel that the development or the view of development goes or is going down a separate lane, another path, separate from the development rhetoric and discourse. And for women development has not been particularly friendly, nor has it been a major contender, because at the end of the day, development also has a nice side, a considerate side, and when that goes together with sustainable development and human rights framework dynamics, this is a road that has permitted women to take advantage of opportunities or have broader spaces for action, but development has a history among women in economic and women's economic discourse. We have had women in development policies, typically policies that are connected to women's conferences, the United Nations, that basically sought to give greater participation to women in the productive world. I wonder if that is just a perception, but it is my impression that development has been always in the productive field and never has gone beyond taking a look at a social reproduction. So the more women who had jobs, the more women who had access to resources, the greater the perspective, the perception that there was progress in women's lives. But when adjustment policies are put into practice, or when liberalization, trade liberalization, and investment liberalization take traction, you realize that this kind of development makes women poorer and devoid of any sufficient tools to fight back. So women have to do that themselves, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing. But these have been strategically women who have set these experiences in motion about collective care of a life and leading our homes. That's kind of a, it's not really like that, because women were always inside and outside their homes, but it has allowed to weave networks that were different from what a straightforward development strategy could provide. And there are a lot of narratives on what was the result, not of the that resulted not in the antagonism, but rather the difference between the roads that were taken by women in their struggles in our countries against global economic policies, and that escaped the traditional development frameworks. Just by way of putting on the table, bringing to our debate this issue. Is that okay? Yes. I'm delighted. I was delighted to hear all that. Thanks very much.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, thank you very much, Patty. And I believe that it's worth mentioning that one of the achievements of this encounter is that we need to leave the place with the idea that the world is fragile, that the world is vulnerable, that we are interdependent, and that it all depends fundamentally on the care that we provide. If we assume this, that Patty has suggested, and that's in the sense of the collective care for life, I believe that a huge part of our achievement of this event, we can take it away as a result by itself if we are able to input this into our emotional intelligence. We can go back happy home, because even as an important suggestion facing our kids, our children, when we tell them that the effort or sovereignty that you mentioned when we talk about indigenous societies, and we just recently in the Panamazonico Forum, and one of the things that called our attention the most was to back up the or advocate for the rights of the people and not contact the population and for their rights. And you see clearly there how the protection of rights at the task of care. So Patty, we appreciate quite a lot all the amount of things that we're taking away with us. This is not a manifest, it's a webbing. Thank you very much, Patty. But up next we will have Armando de Negri. Armando de Negri, he is the coordinator of the Executive Committee for the World Forum of Health and Social Security. Is also a member of the Mechanism of Specialists in the Right for Development in the Council of Human Rights of the United Nations, and currently in Mexico is a specialized consultant, international special consultant in services of health in the World Health Organization and in the World Health Organization in Mexico. Armando, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here, and we also see Francine. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Francine. And you have the mic for 20 minutes. Thank you very much, Armando. Just 1 second, Armando. Okay. We can try now. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think that the debate is always really challenging because it starts with something that it's always there, which is the definition of what is development for us. And what am I going to do is speak from a development point of view, and a huge dispute that's been taking place around this. What I'd like to say that the right to development starts with a national sovereignty principle and the termination of the people, and thereby the right to development establishes that for the people to establish what type of development they want. And that takes us back to the different points about the way that we communicate and we represent this right for the people of the South. It's the fight to establish and to indicate the decolonizing of the societies beyond breaking the barrier of colonialism to achieve the independence of countries. And the problem that persists is the internalization, the way that we see our southern societies, and the dependency, the lack of space, political space of construction of alternate hegemony, that it will be favorable for a different type of power project. And now we have different tensions crossing that will have to reivindicate people and in all of their scopes, cultural, ethnical, of gender, of the way of perceiving the political exercise itself of decisions. And that's why the desire to development is not something linked to the financial growth as to impose the logic of neoliberal development or of different currents of neoliberalism, but actually a reivindication of sovereignty and self-determination that will integrate a whole particular vision of human rights as a whole. That's why this long path since the Bandung Conference in 1955 in Indonesia that was aiming to the basis that was going to be afterward the non-aligned movement that was created at the beginning of the 60s. There was a path that was focused on to the search of a right to enjoy completely the richness produced in countries through a redistribution of this richness constructed collectively and translated into a condition of life that will or would respect the needs of people within a framework of dignity of existence. And this projection from Bandung reached to us in a sequence of conquering southern countries that have been not aligned by organizing blocks of opposition to the Occidental hegemony and capitalistic that established socializing policies that reivindicated strongly, especially social rights of transformational character. And then the economy topic, and speaking of transformational economies, we also reivindicated as a tool the economy as something that we can re-enter into the social life that would allow the materiality of social, cultural, and financial rights, and later on environmental as well, in a whole array of civil rights and politicians and societies that look after the projection of the economy as something that can make us go back to social life, and that's fundamental. It's fundamentally the style of development and to face the structural inequalities of our societies. And from there, the vindication in the Declaration of the Right to Development in 1986 of gender equality, of the way, on the primary way of vindication of the right linked to environment that will be developed further on in a clearer manner in the international scenario. And also a systemic articulation of the sum of all these rights and a way to construct bases for social security and for a whole of protection that will allow to overcome inequality actively. That's why the tradition or the ontology that proposes a right to development from the Declaration of 86 and nowadays with the proposal of a treaty of a legally binding instrument that has to do with development, it's a sovereign reivindication of self-determination of the nations and people of the South. That's why I wanted to strongly call to the attention of how important it is, this debate, and how important it is to reinsert in our political agenda the development subject. Development, as I insist, is not necessarily development established upon a continuous financial growth with a huge environmental and social cost. On the other hand, and we can reivindicate the development right from a macro right and an environmental point of view that as something that is projected through its social, environmental, and financial justice scope, just as for the structural inequalities and the contention of the exploitation or the limitless exploitation of natural resources, but that also implicates the need of development projects or the national development projects and regional as well that would have as a main or final goal the search for a balance or dynamic balance between satisfaction of social and human needs and preservation of natural capacities in regards of limited resources. And that takes us back to this core debate within the development of right, which is the reaction between finances and the treaty itself of development, which picks up now as a core point in the Declaration of the Development Right, which was developed in the 86, which establishes a new order financially and international. That establishes again an international new political order, as the financial side is also structured as a manifestation of power, especially by the concentration of financial capital in monopoly and oligopolization of the main chains of production and distribution chains of the world. And when distribution, I'm talking about logistically. That's why a permanent search of accumulation without limit of financial capital as an expression of power in a way that ends up being a determinant factor in the making of political communities, like for example in parliament, in the way that we penetrate the communication or in the media, and also how we work in the legal scope and compositions that are really taking us back from the standpoint of rights, because they're radical in the preservation of the right of property and the capital freedom, making it for us to have a democracy that's toothless and that takes us back to the land of conflict, a political conflict that at the same time is an object of repression and is an object of limitation of the free space and the free protest rights. So this is not, it is only a debate that doesn't focus only in the social or finance world, but it also articulated throughout dimensions. And thinking about a development right nowadays, it will be to primarily face the causes that avoid us to have this development right, the structures that reproduce inequality itself. So within colonialism or the coloniality that we talked about the patriarchal and political expressions, and the whole process that will take us to society that will run to survive, most of the people, and that accepts a way or the other that the way that we live is the only way that we see hegemonically as approachable or reachable, and thereby being a victim also of a continuous exercise of political communication where we stray away from the possibility of exercising power and what rights and what type of development do we want, and at the same time it subjects us to this unbreakable sought for individualistic character of consumption with the possibility of the individual resource instead of collective type of projects. That's why I want to put into evidence what's going to happen now, that we need to approve the Treaty of Development right in the Council of Human Rights in the month of September or October. And then it will be submitted to the National Assembly. So that's been a long path from the southern countries that still constitute non-aligned movements, and it's our political reivindication that we should all be really attentive to, because it's been approved, and I believe it will be approved. This treaty of development right. This will open debate in countries because it has to be ratified by a local politician. Then we need to put on the table what is the development that we want, how we want it, to make it real for social and environmental justice, and in what way in this project can we have a coherent development within the framework of right and building upon a new referent, and how can we organize life in society. We've gotten out really weakened from this pandemic process that's not over, but we are out of it in the sense that we have forced a naturalization of the pandemic itself. And the pandemic deepened or created the landscape to deepen inequalities. What Naomi Klein called to our attention years ago about the doctrine of shock. In the crisis generated by the pandemic allowed the radicalization of many principles of free market and the limitation of civic space, of the democratic space, and the deepening of reforms. There are reforms of authority or limitation of social expenses, and that's why we have populations that are unprotected more and more. The mindset that the pandemic came or after the pandemic having the Ukraine-Russian war causes a lot of social fragility when we see the food sector or different cost of life, and it generates more social unprotection. And in the ways of development, we want to connect it to an agenda that's being proposed by the General Secretary. There's a thinking about the way of building a new pact, a new eco-social pact, a new contract, a new eco-social contract that will allow us to put on the table and to discuss within the space of the institutionality and the state the relationship with society. And in the scope of relation or international relations, also a different perspective that will allow us to face this immediate crisis of inequality combined with the environmental and climate crisis that are potentially dangerous. But we need to break this hegemony of the financial capital, and that the way that this has been installing itself in all levels and in social policies as well. And in this framework of this new social contract, we establish the idea of deepening and on what the social security system would be and of social protection. And in there we input the persistence of the political economy, and how do we go towards this broader spectrum of social protection or protection overall, and how this vindicates the vision that we have, the view that we have of finance, of the financial politics, the policy of care means a broader production of value, of social value, that's also a part of important reivindication from different feminist currents that would also open a greater visibility to the social reproduction. But we shouldn't leave aside the dispute about production and distribution and redistribution of wealth produced broadly in or across domains, and even in this domain of care. And for that, in the framework of this different socialization of social policies, is nowadays a really important topic, and we are really captured by impossibilities, meaning a transition that will be in favor of a development that's capable of environmental justice, and it will need to refine the mechanisms of appropriation and redistribution of wealth in the field of justice, of fiscal justice in this fiscal space of states, and in the confrontation of the architecture of debts or international debts and national debts, and the way that make it mandatory through taxing and avoidance of accumulation for financial capital to finally leverage the production. In this way, the extension or the distributive extension from the existing mechanisms. I believe that in this scope, Armando, I'm sorry, we only have 5 minutes, so you can start closing it up. So that's why the dispute of this framework of development will allow us to relocate in geopolitics worldwide to planned out from the South a different perspective that will have a more immediate social and political impact, and that's where Eduardo's intervention resounded within the China subject, because their replenishment of resources, or they use a lot of resources, and they encourage a whole system of industrialization, especially in the Asian and Central Asian core. That is a challenge for us in Latin America, because this industrialization made us really fragile, and even to be able to create a whole industrialization that's more according to our own tasks and duties in relation to nature. And this appropriation of industrial processes and reprimarization of our economy leaves us in a really fragile situation, and that's why the financial project or to re-input this project into the social life, and with a big capacity of equilibrium or balance environmentally, it's a persistent challenge and an urgent need. So the capacity of our economies in favor of combat against our historical inequalities takes us back to the audacity that's necessary, and especially to find the universalization of proposals. I believe that most of times the segmentation of particularisms of social struggles that will provide new outlook, new perspectives, but won't reach to, or won't be able to get to consolidate as a universal type of project that will be broader. And we have a strategic political dispute that's quite important, and here the sense of economy, it starts being an object of dispute that will take us to one of the dimensions of one universalist dimension that's fundamental, meaning how production and value production within the social economy will allow us to face deeper and urgently social inequalities. I'll just close it out by saying that there's a threat that these huge masses of population represent that are exploited, where accumulation corresponds to the continuous increase of inequality. We will have to discuss back again why development with these universalist aspirations in terms of well-being was substituted, and really effectively, sadly, by a discourse about poverty, where the social politics ends up being captured absolutely by one only object, poverty itself, without considering that poverty could be the direct product of this mutuality between the concentration of wealth and the disappropriation for big masses of our population. And that's where we can find the reivindication towards a new centrality on social justice development, or to be able to sustain a universalistic project capable of facing the structural differences, and that deserves a deep investigation on how do we represent what's social. The idea of vulnerability, for example, in a category which essentially built as a functional category to what the capitalistic accumulation of the neoliberal stage is. So the identity of vulnerables is not a political identity, but an identity of beneficiaries of policies of compensation, social and financial. And that's where we subtract and we take out the possibility for exploited masses to have a transformational identity or a transformative identity based on emancipation and power. And that's why this project of power. And that's why it's important to break the hegemony of the social economy that's limited to fight or poverty, mitigating it in a limited manner, and to represent this concept of what's social for a broader concept. And to my comprehension, it could be the concept of development with social justice and with environmental justice. And that's all I wanted to say, and I'll just repeat the need of taking this dispute seriously about the development treaty that can open a whole array of revisions about the way that we see and think about society, conducting transformation that are more than urgent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Armando. Very nice of you. Well, I believe that Armando has repeated and invited us back again, and this is an invite to a process that's linked to the discussion on the binding contract with the United Nations and the development or the right for development. So with all these topics, I believe that it's important that we can stimulate us. So in this second quarter or the second semester, to be binded or linked to this type of work and participation. So thank you very much, Armando, for all your thoughts about the link of human right to development, and of course the interdependency that comes from there to think about an economy that's at the service of the development of the rights of people. So
Now I see Eduardo is holding his jacket, and I would like to make a minor change to suggest a couple of questions, and I also have to make sure that my audience will not fall asleep because we're all getting tired. So there's going to be a couple of questions, and I would like thank Francisco, and I'm thanking him in advance because we have already used a lot of our time, and now these interventions would close this segment of our event. So before Eduardo leaves, it's going to take him only a couple of minutes. And Carola, perhaps? Your questions? Thanks very much, Herman. Taking advantage of the fact that Eduardo is still here with us from the viewpoint of an economist and from the viewpoint of climate issues. I think that we have to go through a regional transition and leave behind the extractivist system. And when you talk about the urgency of saving the patient, what happens when the patient is the planet itself? And we hear all the data on the intergovernmental climate change panel that give us less than 3 years to undergo this transformation, and we know that the region is responsible for under 10% of emissions, and that the main actions have to come from China, from the global north, that are the main extractors of the planet's resources and are the greatest sources of emissions, and they have priorities that are taken away from the necessary actions. So what where are you from? Bolivia. And what can we do to change this condition, given that we have such a short time to assure the sustainability of life? Eduardo. There are so many things that I would like to ask you, but we are particularly concerned that we're working a lot on the issue of the United European Union and Mercosur agreement that is having significant consequences on the Brazilian biomass, but also in the Cerrado and other environmental regions, and I was wondering what would be the impact of all this on international trade. And also it seemed to me interesting to think about this debate about placing poverty center stage of this debate, and subsidies and the way that poverty is addressed, thinking in terms of subsidies and the basic income, and how that obliterates the transformative ability. I think you could elaborate on that very interesting issue. And a last one, this is for Patricia. What somebody want to ask Patricia a question? Thank you. Eduardo, over to you. The question you've just made is a key. My response will be politically incorrect. I think a large part of the political debate does not understand what you have just asked. There's a lot of people that think of political issues from a old standpoint from both sides of the debate. Whether they are on one side or the other of the debate, they are still thinking with 20th century debates. What you have mentioned is of such a huge urgency that
What should be debated are all the things that are of the first order and for which there is no time. The transition that I talked to you about are urgent because several of the countries that are represented here will no longer have hydrocarbons in the near future, and they do not have any energy reconversion strategy to replace them. They're going to have to import more oil byproducts than they today. They misused money from exports because they do not diversify the productive matrix. So when I hear these political debates, I understand what either side holds, but it seems that they are talking in Latin about middle-age issues, and they do not realize the urgency of these matters. All countries are being affected at a breakneck speed by climate change. And I'm thinking of Colombia, for instance. A little before the election, there was a debate on whether the Petro administration should or should not continue to dig coal, given that the prices are very high due to the Ukrainian war. Several environmentalists, and I'm thinking of Manuel Rodríguez from the National Environmental Forum that joined Brigitte Baptiste's position for hydrocarbons and Manuel in regards of coal, because from as they both thought that they should export more of these resources because that would give Colombia more money for solving their issues, and they both, but there's a couple of mistakes. They said that this would not have an impact, environmental impact, because Colombia, Bolivia's participation in the world coal trade is very small, but all countries are responsible and all have to decrease their emissions. To say that my neighbor emits more so I have a right to continue meeting. It's like the Middle East monarchies. And a different thing is what are the measures to tackle that issue. But everybody is responsible. Secondly, there is no concrete empirical evidence or practical evidence that increasing coal and hydrocarbon exports have helped in the country to address poverty issues and equity issues on a permanent basis. There's been even slight reductions during the super cycles because the issues are structural. So you will realize that in the environmental community, they do not realize any of these things, and they do not understand that countries, what a country exports will be burnt by another player somewhere else in the world, and state-owned oil companies all the way from Petrobras, PDVSA in Venezuela, and all the way to the great state-owned companies in the Middle East. When you go along the entire value chain from the extraction to final burning, but the responsible agents are the state-owned companies, the large oil state-owned companies. And so I absolutely share your warning, and the question is whether this is a urgent or very severe crisis, even more so with the Ukrainian part. And in particular, when we took a look at the mitigated or reduced plant and animal health controls and what people in Europe eat, and therefore the European consumer, and that's going to have a impact in several sectors. That's going to have an impact in the monocrops, both in the south and in the north. But what I have tried to do is to translate this debate into how can we debate this with the people, because Mercosur is such a discredited organization on both sides. So it is like we have to reconstruct the debate on the importance of Mercosur, to start almost from scratch. I'm sorry, I have to go. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Eduardo. Have a great trip back home. And now we're going to listen to Francine, who is with us from Belgium. She's a member of the Health and Social Security Forum that we have invited this year to the meeting in Mexico City. She's a sociologist and she's an expert on poverty issues, inequality, and the founder of the World Network, the World's Global Justice Network, and as I mentioned, a member of the World Social Forum for Health and Social Protection. Francine, over to you for 10 minutes, and thanks awfully for joining us this late at night over there. Thank you very much. Very briefly, I think that we have just heard is very, very interesting. The three things, presentations that we've heard, and if we could, how should I say that? If we don't forget the key points of the three presentations, that'd be just so useful because we have such a short time. I would like to answer in the first place the question about poverty. What happened in 1990 when the World Bank published their first poverty report was the consequence of a huge effort to forget the notion of development that previously, before 1990, was a collective project as societies and nations driven project. This was called DONAC, and that would allow us to move there afterwards to a neoliberal individual project in the fight against poverty. And it is clear that many people were happy because they thought that the World Bank at the end of the day had a social soul, but that was not actually so, quite the contrary. And we can see that clearly 30 years down the road that poverty has not really abated. It is true that the figures are slightly lower, but there's no fight to struggle against the poverty. There is no struggle against the big ones. It was a program that has been ongoing to adopt a neoliberal policies because, according to the World Bank, these are neoliberal projects that was needed to defeat poverty. So it is my view that the effort that Armando discussed on the right of development is very important, quite to the point, because we need to redefine our concepts. It is true that it is a very controversial concept that we have to think more deeply and redefine that development concept so that it'll be a concept embodying the notion of a progress and it'll be able to move beyond the fight of poverty. Of course, we have to fight poverty and we have to eradicate once and for all poverty, and we can do that through social safety net, other productive systems, a different distribution of resources. But the evidence, as Patricia said, yes, absolutely, we need all that. But Patricia also said something that is at the core of what we need to do. The feminist economy, the care economy, and the commons economy, and the natural resources economy. And the work of redefining development, and not just for South countries, because North countries also need that, perhaps to an even greater extent. They need a different type of development, a different type of life, a different type of economy. So it is my viewpoint that is central, and I am so happy to be able to discuss about these things at this conference, the Latin Data Conference, that addresses issues of tax justice, social justice, and so forth and so on, because these topics are interconnected, and that is something that we should never forget. When we talk about social justice, we are talking about environmental justice, and we're talking about the resources, and we should never separate these topics. We cannot take a silo approach, because they are all interconnected, and the presentations that we just heard are particularly interesting and important. And I thank you tons for those presentations. Thanks, Francine, very much. That's so kind of you. So now we're going to turn it over to Aura for her presentation. Aura is joining us from Colombia. She is Aura Elizabeth Rodríguez Bodilla. She's an economist and a human rights defender and a people's educator. And at present, she is studying development planning MA or MBS, and she works with the Viva la Ciudadanía Corporation in Colombia, where she coordinates the elections observers organization that is and has been so important in the recent elections, and she is presently the technical secretary of a platform that embraces almost 600 Colombian organizations. That's the Colombian Platform for Human Democracy, Human Rights and Development. And good afternoon. I think it is still the afternoon over there, and you have 10 minutes for your comments. Good afternoon, everybody. In the first place, I want to thank you for the invitation. And unfortunately, I can see you in person, as has already been said. I would like to share with you 3 key ideas around the things that have been discussed by our guests. And the first one has to do with the broad discussion about the reproduction of life and the final eventual reproduction of goods and services, the reproduction of humankind and nature as a whole. I think the level of complexity is something that remains to be understood, and it's not well understood by the organizations that we belong to across the several countries, and even less globally. But there is this conflict between life and capital, the importance and need of this economy of care, the crisis of poverty, and the objective of creating a good life, living in delight. And I think that the central axis of these debates, and we should think in terms of the tensions and the stresses of the right to development and life as the way to understand the preservation of nature, the planet, and the people. The panel members have been very clear about that. Secondly, as the second thing has to do with opportunities that are created by what has been the positive opportunities created by the pandemic, because the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities and poverty, but it has also sparked the possibility of a potential agreement on the right to development, and that's a great opportunity to debate. something that we see as happening in Colombia and in Latin and other world organizations. And finally, at this point in time, it is important to realize how this debate of the good living and that the economy is not the hub around which mankind revolves, but I think that poses a number of constraints when it comes to achieving a global treatment on human rights. But anyway, this debate about the world's global economy redesign can lead us to a redesigning and debating against about issues that apparently are no longer fashionable or trendy in Colombia. Now we are engaging in these core issues. But we are thinking about global debates and the policies that are destructive. And certainly we have already discussed at the seminar. And the third thing is to mention that the panelists have discussed, and I would like to mention some of the things and how the ongoing changes are urgent as a whole, because if we disappear as humankind, there will be no point in making these urgent calls to action. Our first speaker made an invitation to reflect, and I have heard it several times already. I've heard Eduardo several times already discuss about these emergency measures and the transition measures. And although he has discussed these basically for the energy sector, his proposals as a whole include some very clear ideas that we should go over again, and concerning things like issues and tax justice and ecological emergency measures that aimed at stopping specific disasters and evolutions are some of the more clear ideas that Patricia also mentioned as the need of moving forward in terms of security, and what entails security in terms not of repression and control, but security around the care and the reproduction of life, and how those measures deserve reflection, and also measures to protect the life of environmental activists in each country and worldwide, because this is something that is happening everywhere. And to think Latin America, that for several decades we have been moving in terms of the need for regionalization and to create a more collective project, but with the new changes, that is a new possibility to move forward. And also I would like to recall some of the thinking at a platform in Colombia that seemed to me particularly important. Herman just said that in the last segment, we have to think of changes at the various levels. It's a multi-layer change effort, and we have to raise basic awareness of care for others and for nature. And since the pandemic, I think the new generations in particular have awakened to the need of leveraging their sensitivity and their care for the other and for the rest. And I think that is also fundamental, that a fundamental element that we sometimes leave by the wayside, or that we think in terms of a feminist reivindication rhetoric, but it's not that. Actually, we need to see and live the world in a different way. The good living goes through our skin, our bodies, our effectiveness, and that's a critical issue. The second thing is the possibility not just about criticizing and analyzing from an academic, theoretical, abstract standpoint, but also to turn those into public policies at the local and global levels that could move us forward to what Armando called the universalization of proposals, if I got him right. And the last element is the larger imaginary for the entire planet and humankind that would allow us to survive in a different way, a different kind of survival where good living will be a possibility for the entire humankind in harmony with nature. I want to stop here because I realize that you are all very tired, and thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Aura. Really nice of you. And I think that what you just mentioned is what it's known now as the living nice and sweet living. I want to give and open the mic to Patricia for this last part. And we have a question you asked, and I believe that Romulo wants to make a comment. So I don't know if we go to the questions first and then just to close it out. Well, I wanted to highlight with these interventions, especially about how territories are affected. How territories are affected where we destroy sources of life, spaces where people live and interact with nature and with the cultural ways of their culture. Latin that started to approach these territories by doing a follow-up on the financing and mining extractive companies. That was the first approach to this type of territory, and the second one was through the Social Pan-Amazonic Forum approaching to Amazonic land and territories. Even trying to approach the problematic of mixing Andean and Amazonic systems. This destruction of territories happens because of a couple of reasons. Because people that are unemployed migrate and start trying to adopt the territory to produce. And that's something because of a lack of model of generation of income. And then because there's a more planned out type of action and investment, extractive industry and everything that has to be with palm oil, farming, cattle, and soy, which produce a series of big patches of deforestation, and all this is affecting and destroying the land little by little. And we know that deforestation and the destruction that's ongoing in Brazil and in this type of aspects and in many other countries as well. And we also notice that we have a series of measures that may be not necessarily led us to establish this measure in one country, but it does in others, so we have doing it. So this space of Latin that we review what is debt, what is taxable, what fiscal, and we need to understand what is the relation by being by omission or by being by direct action of these policies, because it's of our scope and it may be we're mandated to, and we have to look for solutions and facing these current policies and planning alternatives, considering the destruction of the territories that provide life. That's one point that I would like to say. Yeah, this is how we see connections and looking at this type of reports and taking into account the opacity that many of these politics have. In second place, I think it's really interesting the effort that is taking place through the psychosocial pacts that are not known probably to join agendas, because another problem that we have, as we heard in one of the presentations, we have financial justice agenda, gender, or feminist finances, but we have not articulated any of them. In the Eco-Social Pact of the South, we have made an effort to articulate all of this, and maybe not known by everyone, but we have a Southern Pact. So we need to look at how do we spread it out. But the third point, and I think that the big umbrella or the big point of it is care. Care is present there, and like we said, we need to make it known and visible. And just to finish off with my intervention and addressing these 2 points, the point here and the subject is on how do we place this upon society. The question is, are we enough with our multi-stakeholder conferences and multi-actors So it's important to maybe if we can place these reports in our own social networks. And what else are we missing? Because I think this should be a part of the conference. How are we, or how can we think about this in this, or amidst this political and financial turbulence that we live in the world? And that's it. I'm just mentioning it because I think that it's time to relating this to what we see as the political action and communicative action. So that's where maybe the darkness comes, because we are at a really complicated point. But anyway, I think that we need to make an effort to see what are we going to do. So this is the what are we going to do is a part of of this conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Romulo. Really kind of you. All right. So. Well, no more comments because we are rather tired, but I think that aligned to what Roger said, we shouldn't lose our links. I think it's vital in the making and the application and in the strength of work that we want to place it, the necessity of enrooting ourselves, always being particularly in our land, the need of having a radicalization of the democratic agenda is the moment to do so, because we are right now in a discussion between China and the US, but actually this is an empire that is crumbling apart, and it's going to be reshaped, and we don't know how. But this is space to radicalize an agenda, and the climate crisis, which is not an exaggeration, but rather a reality that we have not taken as a part of our awareness and in our minds and souls. So I think that it requires it. I think that we have clues. It's difficult to establish a formula or an equation, but if you can move forward with it, wonderful. When I say you, I mean Latindad. In this, I think that we're doing fine, and all the instruments that we've talked about here in the institutional framework, yeah, we need to see how to take advantage of it. Pati, well, okay, we'll leave a closing to Armando that has a question that Graciela has made for him. And I apologize to the people for the next panel because we've taken a few more minutes. So Armando, if you like, you have responsibility of closing us out. Do we have Armando there? Can you hear me? Yes, Armando. All right, thank you very much. I think that something that we need to internalize is the need of facing the complexity of this construction of alternatives, and especially not getting overwhelmed in a sort of dispute about what is the core element. The reality has many centralities in the sense that paradoxically we have different dimensions that we need to look for, to articulate it, to be able to construct an alternative hegemony with a project of power. Let me insist on that. So in that aspect, in the last few years, in the form of safety and social security, in dialogue with different thematic forums like the Pan-Amazonic one of transformational economy and so on, we were able to plan out this topic of tackling complexity from a series of huge challenges. I believe that we have three big crises that we've been talking about today in this panel. It is a democratic crisis, a social crisis, an environmental crisis. And just as a sort of transversality of it or horizontality of it, there's many dimensions of it, from a nuclear conflict that was never as palpable as it is now, and also a problem of peace and the way that social movements are repressed nowadays, and the militarization of the social life, the radical groups getting armed of extreme right, and all this configures or sets up a threat to the peace and the possibility of a development with social justice. And for that, to be able to face this complexity, I think that we need to look for a common ontology about how do we build this conservative current hegemony, how this crisis establishes this old world that's there alive, meaning it's not dying yet, as the guy he was explaining. We're in a critical territory, I might say, even, that demands us to be wiser about how to articulate our struggle and within the emergency of particular elements and the need, as I was saying, within universalisms. The universalism in the sense of constructing projects that at this point are looking at how accumulated we are and accumulation of strength that we have can be transformed really in a trend of transformation that's feasible and sustainable facing the resiliences that we find. I always think of government like the Petro government and the Boris, but again Lula, and here in Mexico the López Obrador administration. How is it that they face this completely and deeply complicated context in a degree of conflictivity that's really high, social-wise and politically and financially, and that we always have a lot of expectations about governments being able to respond to this in the short term, and the reality is that we're not prepared for that. Governments sail in really muddy and dark waters with a lot of illegal binding situation and financial situation with correlation of international forces, and being aware of that will help us to think about and without abusing urgency to open perspectives of transition that would allow us to move forward without backing up so much. Let me give you an example that if this whole issue of poverty in between quotes as a unique category of social policies or neoliberal is not surpassed by an idea of redistribution, active redistribution of wealth, and it's not enough these transferences or rents of citizenship and so on, but rather it's a social sense of transformation of the economy in terms of at least being able to sustain social politics. And if we don't do that, what we are creating is a group of social resentment that's greater and greater, and opening the space for fascist projects in society. So we'll be going back and forward in this process with this. If our government, which is more democratic and more progressive, fails in their first round of responses, we'll immediately have a pragmatic backing up of the social needs being imposed and sought for a solution that will be promising. And we see the whole problem, and that we cannot ignore where the forces of the right-wing forces have remained and are remaining alive in this discussion. So how to surpass the fragilized manner that we find ourselves in, and responding directly to the poverty, vulnerability, and social management of risk that were sequences that Francine mentioned with the World Bank in '90, and then in 2000 he creates a concept, a social concept of risk, vulnerable, in the way that they stress social policies in going after to the poorest ones so we can give them some sort of remediation, well, without facing the matrix of inequality. That's something that we need to have present, and to think in what way are we going to step out of this hegemonic logic to a redistributive type of logic of wealth. But for that we need to tackle down a whole legal apparatus that's been built by this neoliberal project. And that implicates a political education in a grand scale of society, meaning a huge effort for political education That might be the principle, the main thing that we have to do in the framework of our progressive governments, democratic governments, to look for them to be popular in the sense of being able to sustain political education that won't solve all the problems but will establish ways and different methods, and we can give strength to the way that we see a perspective of care and from the perspective of radicality, social, democratic, and environmental. I think that these are the elements that are challenging. But to be together, to work together, and to face this is key. And opportunities such as this for the development, right, can synthesize the importance of the agenda and move us around moving forward, because we need to be fast enough, but knowing that we need to consolidate the steps that we're taking. And one last thing is to look at the geopolitics. We have a new political international order being born. Where are we going to be at in Latin America in relation of this new order? It will be an equilibrium between pragmatism and the will of being capable of self-determining in terms of a new multipolar game. I think that that's also something that needs to be present. It's a part of the delicate process of transition that we need to establish. Thank you. Thank you, Armando. Well, with your intervention then, let me thank Patricia. Thank you very much, Armando, Eduardo, that should be on his plane. Francine, thank you very much, Francine. Thank you very much, Shara. To everyone that been in our broadcast, and good afternoon for everyone. Thank you. After a short break of a few minutes only, we'll have our final panel on regional integration. That's really interesting. And the final declaration.